Hi, folks. We're at Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this radio, audio, no pictures live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the creation of a new middle class. Now, this has materialized sort of before our eyes without us really knowing or seeing it or realizing that it was happening. So this is the neo middle class. These are the people who are the primary opinion shapers, and they're given this role by the globalist controlled media, of course. But they're a globalist. They're not a middle class in any organic sense. They're a middle class created. They're invented by the globalists for the purpose of furthering the globalist program and implementing the globalist project. So they're if you like, project specific to the globalist requirements. So let me talk a little bit about that. Now, this is a middle class that isn't defined as such, but it does exist, and it is very influential. These are the class of commentators that the globalist media defer to. They're the ones that come on and get interviewed and say that anyone that opposes mass immigration is Hitler and so on. They have a huge role to play, and again, they've been invented for purpose. Now, excuse me, 30 plus years ago, these people didn't exist, and the middle class, as we traditionally understood it, was brought into existence through technological advancements, but also primarily organic means. The early Victorians in Victorian England, which is where, of course, the Industrial Revolution kicked off, these were deemed or defined as really working class people with some sort of skills, maintaining spinning jenny equipment or something like that, driving a steam engine, but where they would have continuous employment. So middle class was a working class person, ostensibly making a working class wage, but having continuous employment. Working class people were really just casual labourers back in the day. When there was work around, they would do it. People who were, fit and strong and had a strong back, they would have regular work, whereas other people maybe not. So casual labourers. But this was the case, by the way, up until the Great Depression. If you look at the majority of jobs in the United States in the Roaring Twenties, as they called it, 1920s, this is pre, of course, the Great Depression in 1929, the majority of jobs were casual labourers. And these were the people who, of course, were hit the hardest when the Depression came. If you look at government employees, skilled employees, they weren't affected. They were affected, but nowhere near as much. Unemployment amongst labourers was more than 50%, but amongst the rest of the population, it was really 10% around that. So the main people who were affected were, of course, these labourers. So really, this idea of a middle class skilled people having continuous employment, that was the earlier definition. Now the definition changed to being skilled and then educated people, and these were, of course, from days of merit. So if you had like a degree, the only way you get to university, or the only way you get to senior high school, was merit. The only way you get from senior high school to university was merit. So merit and education and high standards, meritorious standards, these were the differentiators, if you like, in terms of class. Now, I remember certainly when I was a kid, in my late teens, early 20s, if you met someone who was a PhD, because there were hardly any of them around back in the day, if you met someone who's a PhD, they were considered to me, wow, they were they were demigods, for goodness sakes. Now today they hand out PhDs. How can we create an equal society? How can we create a society where everyone's equal? Well, we'll just give everyone a PhD. I mean, duh. And this is very much the view that the communists and the socialists had in, say, the Soviet Union and even much of China is, how do you create equality? Well, give everyone a degree. So you look at Mao's Red Guard, the Cultural Revolution. These were primarily college kids. Very few, if any, who'd actually got to college on any sort of known merit. They were there for ideological reasons. And so Mao created a revolutionary class of people, as indeed the communists did in the Soviet Union, a revolutionary class of people to effectively be the foot soldiers of the revolution. And these people, they're younger and they're typically under the age of 30, but and they've got affirmative or the equivalent back in the day in China and the Soviet Union, affirmative action degrees, families who were through and through peasants were favoured to be given degrees, again to create this image or this idea of a utopian society. Now they would send these people out. For example, when the Soviet Union went to collective farming, it was a huge upheaval, and they were getting rid of the people with the expertise. So there were farmers with a lot of expertise as to what crops could be grown, when you would plant them, when you would harvest them, how many seeds you would keep on hand to plant the next season of crops, and so on. Now the communists, of course, did everything by the numbers and by the tick box and by the affirmative action type concepts. And so they would just have a checklist to go through, whether that checklist bore any resemblance to reality or reflected the expertise necessary to grow the crops. That was don't care. We're dealing with ideology here, and we can force the crops to grow simply because we, the party, we will it ideologically that it must be so. And there was a good joke going around sort of little bit later on. A kid's in a zoo and he sees a camel and he says, "Look what the Bolsheviks did to that horse." So this is very much a Bolshevik mentality. We will it to be so, and thus it will be so. So when the crop yields sort of went to shit, which they did, and you would expect they would, given when you get rid of the people who know what they're doing, this is what happens. When the crop output went down, then the Bolsheviks decided that must be because evil people, Nazis were deliberately stuffing it up. So we'll just go out and we'll take now. So any grain that the farmers were holding for next year's crop, these communists, these revolutionary, people that they'd sent to university to study whatever, study revolutionary fervor, they would just go around and steal all the crops. And if anyone objected, got in the way, or said, "Hey, that's for next year's crops, if you don't mind," they kill them, and millions or many thousands were killed or beaten up very badly. When the next year's crop planting came on, there was no seeds to plant. That had all been taken by the Revolutionary Guards, and so there was no crops to plant the next year, and then starvation caused the death of many millions all across the Soviet Union, and it was all very unnecessary. And the same happened, of course, in also something very similar happened in China, and again happened in Pol Pot's Cambodia, where they created these Revolutionary Guards. So we need to see this new middle class, this created middle class, that the globalists have created. They're the equivalent of the Revolutionary Guard, of course, in many ways. Now, whether you subset them off as Antifa here or Black Lives Matter there or placard waving climate change or Greta Thunberg, it doesn't matter. They're the same overall mass of this created opinion shaping moral arbiter middle class. Now, how they created is, of course, there's a number of ways, and I'll just go through that. Typically, a very small number of people would go from high school to university, back in the day, and this is not long ago, 40 plus years ago. Certainly in Australia, you're looking at around 3% would go to university. Now, the rigor once you're at university was pretty stiff. If you flunked the test, you had to sit before quite a strict university committee. This is the end of year test and so on. If you flunked the test, you had to sit before this committee, and you had to do what's show cause. You had to give a reason why, and you had to say, well, I was in a car accident, my ass got busted up, or my mother died, or this or that. You had to come up with a reason for it, and they would then give you leave to even go on to the next year. Or alternatively, they'd say, okay, well, you've got 30 days to prepare. Then you had to sit the exam again. so that they weren't prepared to let the merit you had to achieve on merit. If you didn't, then they say, look, you're not a good enough student. You're not bright enough to be here at the university. You should leave and go and do something else. And about a third of the kids going to university, slightly more, but around a third of the kids that graduated just couldn't hack it in university. They just couldn't take the rigorous meritorious standards that the university demanded of their students back in the day. So the attrition rate was pretty high. I knew a guy who was who was doing engineering. I think it was mechanical engineering. Bright kid, smart guy, and there's no doubt that he had the brain power to do it. No doubt at all. But his this is in his first year at university. His parents divorced. It was quite ugly and unpleasant, and he was quite deeply. He was quite a sort of sensitive guy, and he was deeply affected by this. So he flunked, and they accepted that excuse, and they gave him reason, and they gave him another go at doing it. He managed to stay in, and I think in the end he did become. I think he ended up with like a PhD in engineering. Actually, this guy, bright guy. But that was the standard of the time. So if you're going to create a middle class through the university system, which is what the globalists were obviously planning at the time, then rigor had to go. You couldn't have merit, and rigor just could not exist. And you create a new class. And this is what the Soviets, the Chinese communists, Pol Pot's goons, and all that. They all did the same thing. East Europeans. They all did the same thing. We want as many kids as possible to go through that university system, because that's how we're going to radicalize them and give them the idea that they are omnipotent. And also in the case of communists, you've got people running around, the revolutionary guards in the Soviet Union or China or anywhere else that are fully and carelessly and casually accepting that they will murder millions of their fellow citizens in pursuit of ideological goals. I mean, that's absolutely monstrous by anyone's language. But once you radicalize these people and give them the idea that they're a superior, morally superior being, and give them this sense of erudition that they previously didn't have, and the sense of those people who used to push you around, now you can push them around, you can even kill them, and you're still morally superior even when you do that. Those people don't deserve to live there. That type of a mental architecture. And it's easy to create this in simple-minded people who haven't had to achieve by merit can be easily seduced with these sorts of things. Now you're not on the bottom anymore. Now you can get there, that type of thing. And these are people who don't have the intellect or the reasoning power to see through it. They're fairly simple people. So what's happened in the West is you've got this whole set of 3% of people going to university, kids from high school going to university. Now you've got in a lot of Western countries, 40%, 50% of the kids that start high school go to university. The majority of them are moronic, and there's a heavy sort of loading of affirmative action here in having as many black lesbians going through university and so on. So these people are now the new moral middle class, and again, invented for purpose, invented for globalist program purpose. And so that's one thing. The next thing is they're given jobs in the public service, now horribly bloated public service, and also a huge NGO sector. Now, the whole NGO sector survives on globalist money. There's nothing organic about the fucking NGO sector. It's global, massive cash infusions of globalist money, not just George Soros, but funneled in through and laundered through the United Nations and various other groups. This too creates vast employment opportunities for this cadre of revolutionary guards and activists. So if you look at the amount of people employed by the United Nations now compared to what it was 40 years ago, the United Nations employs more people than mid-sized countries like Denmark or Norway or Sweden. I mean, it's astonishing the amount of people they employ, and many of these are just radicalized activists who have this moral superiority thing that it's okay to murder millions of people provided you get your outcome of this ideological socialist paradise. So they've created people who are easily controllable, easily manipulated, and the young, of course, but they've also radicalized through the school system as well, as in even primary school now, but certainly high school and senior high school. Now, the third element to this is that the 30 years ago, the best paid, all of the best paid jobs in the economy, or certainly the Australian economy, were private sector jobs. Jobs that where you're involved in producing and creating, building and doing productive things, doing productive work, productive things. Those were the best paid jobs, and always were. Now that's been completely flipped today, where the best paid, you go onto a job board right now and look at the best paid jobs, advertised on an internet employment job board thing. You look at the best paid jobs there, and they'll be with NGOs, they'll be with Quangos, huge explosion in Quangos, again providing employment opportunities, well-paid employment opportunities for these the new neo middle class revolutionary guards of the globalist revolution, and these jobs, the public service, the NGO jobs, the Quango jobs, they now pay better. You're lucky if one in 10 of the best paid jobs in the economy is in the private sector. You're looking at engineers, as I've mentioned many times before, engineers building roads and bridges and major public infrastructure are paid half as much as a diversity director at a fucking university or a college or a government department. That's how insane it is. Also, the government is now spending vast, which is why governments in the West are running massive deficits, by the way, spending vast sums of money through favoured multinational companies and delivering windfall profits to these guys, provided they mass import black and brown peasants, and if they employ black lesbians as deputy vice presidents, and these sort of things. So there's this massive sort of unnecessary, unproductive employment. My estimation is you go into a large company, more than half the jobs are just invented jobs. They're not real jobs, but these are jobs that are being supplied to, again, this neo middle class who can pretend they're doing something, but it's just a funneling of cash into their pockets, and it's a reward for being the revolutionary guard or having the revolutionary guard type mentality. This is the new middle class. This is the middle class we see. So when you look at, say, a lot of the media companies, the journalists and the supposed experts in the public service and the Bureau of Meteorology, every institution, every public service institution, every board of directors of a museum, and on it goes. They are all stacked now with this neo middle class. And it's happened without us really knowing. It's been quite insidious. You wouldn't have thought 40 years ago that the university system would revolve around how many affirmative action non-meritorious degrees they could hand out, which would then be a measure of their success and their attitudes towards what they think is social utility. You wouldn't even think that. You wouldn't imagine it. I certainly wouldn't have back then. But even when the beginning, when I started to have my suspicions about it, saying, how can these, I remember going to the US, because the company I worked for, we opened up a few offices around the US. And I remember, interviewing people who had degrees and masters and so on, who were still illiterate. And I couldn't work out how could somebody be so moronic when they've got 2 degrees and a master's. It seemed inconceivable to me, because Australia hadn't actually fully embraced that path at the time. But in the US, they had. So there's a lot of people running around with multiple degrees and think they're superior, morally superior beings. Well, I must be, because I've got 2 degrees and a master's. I must be, and so on. And want to show off their newfound erudition. But really, they're just, in the end, revolutionary guards, and should be seen as much. Their job is, if you like, to kill off the other people, and to do it without turning a hair. And we need to realise now these people are in place, and they are. They're not going to do nice things to us. And the idea of this mass immigration, and if you're a white male, you must be Hitler, and this is all part of that wider narrative that they've acquired and that they push on through media outlets and the like. But this neo middle class, as I'm calling them, we need to understand that they're there, and we need to understand what they're doing. We need to understand their purpose, how they're being employed, and what they're doing to us. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.